What if I told you the world's greatest luxuries didn't come from brilliance, but from disaster? In the late 1600s, winemakers across the Champagne region faced what looked like total ruin. Bottles were exploding one after another, glass shards flying through the air, entire harvests spoiled. The wine inside had turned strange, bubbly, uncontrollable. For winemakers who had staked their livelihoods on predictable wine, this chaos meant financial ruin. But instead of discarding the ruined batch, some dared to taste it. And what they discovered would transform failure into fortune, disaster into celebration. The drink that almost destroyed an industry became the symbol of wealth, status, and joy, the drink we still raise to the most important moments of our lives. Quick challenge: name one disaster in your own life that actually led to something better. I bet you can think of one. Share it in the comments if you're comfortable. In the 1600s, winemakers across Champagne faced catastrophe. Bottles weren't just spoiling, they were bursting without warning. Not dozens at once, but enough to make every cellar a gamble. Imagine walking in to check your stock and hearing a single crack, then glass shards whistling past your face. A year's profit, gone in minutes. The problem was unfinished fermentation. Trapped gas built pressure until the bottles exploded, creating a drink no one wanted to buy: fizzy, unstable, alive. Most merchants saw ruin. Some whispered it was cursed, wine that refused to obey. But here's the turning point: why would anyone taste a product that had just destroyed their livelihood? The answer lies in desperation. When you've lost everything, curiosity becomes courage. But the transformation didn't happen overnight. That single act of tasting disaster was only the spark. The real genius was branding the flaw as a feature, turning instability into celebration. That shift didn't just save a few bottles. It created an industry worth billions. Today, a single bottle of Dom Perignon vintage can cost $300, proof that what began as an accident now defines luxury itself. Here's the real question: have you ever turned a personal disaster into an advantage? Because that's exactly what happened next. The chemistry was simple. The courage was not. When bottles exploded, most winemakers saw the end of their careers. But a few saw the beginning of something revolutionary. In 1683, Claude Moët faced a choice: destroy his remaining sparkling wine or risk his family's reputation on an untested, unstable drink. He chose to bet everything on bubbles. His gamble meant stronger glass, thicker corks, even crude iron clamps to hold bottles together. Each experiment was a roll of the dice with money, safety, and honor at stake. But time was running out. Some families abandoned the region entirely. Others doubled down, gambling that what ruined them could also save them. It was a knife's edge between disgrace and history. And slowly, what was once whispered as the devil's wine began to transform into something rare and desirable. A mistake became a marker of distinction. Here's the real test: name one flaw that actually makes something more valuable. I'll give you a hint: it's probably in your pocket right now. Phones are designed with imperfections, like textured grips or notches, to make them more appealing. The first time champagne was served at Versailles, guests were horrified. Bubbles meant failure. But then the king himself raised his glass and called it divine chaos. Overnight, what had been shameful became fashionable. Claude Moët and others leaned into the risk, framing the bubbles as energy, life itself. Nobles described the sensation as electric, sensual, unlike anything else. Suddenly, flaws weren't being hidden, they were being celebrated. The economics shifted almost instantly. Within a decade, bottles that once sold for pennies commanded the price of gold. Families bankrupted by exploding cellars watched rivals become millionaires. But the real genius wasn't the bubbles themselves, it was understanding what people actually buy when they choose luxury. Why did champagne succeed where so many other failures faded into history? It wasn't just the bubbles. It was the story. Luxury, psychologists say, isn't about the product itself. It's about what it signals. When nobles drank champagne, they weren't just tasting wine, they were showing they could afford to waste money on a flawed, risky, unpredictable drink. That made it the perfect status symbol. Quick challenge: think of a status symbol today, a luxury brand, a flashy car, or an exclusive club. What do you think its secret flaw is that people are actually paying for? At Louis XIV's court, serving champagne became a power move, proof you could risk your fortune on bottles that might explode in the cellar while your rivals played it safe. Economists call this the scarcity premium. The harder it is to make, the more desirable it becomes. A bottle of ordinary wine was common. A bottle of champagne was dangerous, rare, and unpredictable, which made it irresistible. Today, that psychology still drives the market. A single bottle of Dom Perignon vintage can cost over $300, not because the grapes are inherently magical, but because it carries centuries of prestige built on failure. Supreme drops limited quantities. Rolex builds waiting lists. Tesla creates production constraints. All learn champagne's lesson, make scarcity the selling point. But the real twist? Champagne wasn't the only disaster that became a luxury. By the 18th century, what began as a cellar disaster had transformed into Europe's most coveted drink. But this wasn't an overnight success. For decades, champagne was a gamble. Bottles still exploded. Some batches tasted flat, others too sharp. And yet, among the nobility, demand surged. Why? Because the unpredictability itself became part of the allure. At Versailles, serving champagne was a statement. Guests didn't just sip it, they performed with it. Every pop of a cork was theater, every bubble a symbol of luxury that defied reason. One account from a royal banquet described guests gasping as a bottle foamed over, only for Louis XIV himself to laugh and declare it divine chaos. Overnight, what had once been humiliation became high fashion. This is the hidden rule of luxury: people don't just buy things. They buy stories. Champagne's story was irresistible, a tale of failure reborn as triumph. That same psychology shows up across history. Roman elites wore jewelry made from shattered glass, flaunting beauty born from breakage. Medieval merchants sold spices once considered spoiled as rare delicacies. Even today, luxury brands thrive on scarcity and imperfection. Supreme drops limited quantities. Rolex has years-long waiting lists. Tesla manufactures production constraints as marketing. All follow champagne's blueprint, make scarcity the selling point. Economists call this the scarcity premium. A bottle of ordinary wine was common. A bottle of champagne was dangerous, rare, and unpredictable, which made it irresistible. Today, that psychology still drives the market. A single bottle of Dom Perignon vintage can cost over $300, not because the grapes are inherently magical, but because it carries centuries of prestige built on what began as failure. Think about your own life. What's one thing you own that's technically flawed, but you value it more because of that imperfection? Share it in the comments, because sometimes the crack in the glass is what makes it priceless. But here's the real twist: champagne wasn't the only disaster that became a luxury. So what do exploding bottles and dangerous wine teach us about human behavior? That the line between disaster and desire is far thinner than we imagine. Champagne wasn't loved because it was perfect, it was loved because it was unpredictable, risky, and rare. In other words, its failure became its feature. This isn't just about wine. History is full of inventions born from mistakes. Post-it notes were the result of a failed attempt at superglue. Penicillin came from a petri dish that was ruined by mold. Even the slinky began as a failed stabilizer for naval equipment. Each of these products carried the same hidden ingredient: someone looked at a failure and decided not to throw it away, but to try again. And that's the genius of failure: it forces us to see value where no one else can. Economists remind us that entire industries thrive on this principle. Scarcity, imperfection, even unpredictability, they're not flaws, they're features. A Rolex that takes years to obtain. A limited sneaker drop that sells out in minutes. A vintage bottle of champagne that costs hundreds, not because it's rare in nature, but because it's rare by design. But here's the challenge for us. If the world's greatest luxuries, and even some of its most important discoveries, came from mistakes, then maybe our own failures aren't endings either. They might just be beginnings waiting for a new story. So here's your question: what's one failure in your life that, looking back, became an unexpected turning point? Share it if you're comfortable. And remember, sometimes the thing that feels broken today might be the very thing that makes your story unforgettable tomorrow. Because if champagne was born from chaos, what other disasters might secretly be the inventions of tomorrow? Stick around, the next story might just change how you see every mistake.